Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. In today's topic, as you can see, is a continuation of our lecture on World War II, but this time focusing exclusively on the home front. But before we begin, as always, take a moment, jot down that lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical context. You got it? Let's begin. Now, we left off last time with Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II. Now, of course, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the debate over whether we should be involved in another world war was virtually non-existent. It was a few here and there, obviously, but virtually non-existent. And the country was broadly unified behind this war, unlike, of course, World War I. And therefore, we're going to see a kind of a different tact when it came to getting volunteers. Because remember, in World War I, almost everyone who went was drafted. It was very unpopular. In World War II, though, things are very, very different. By July of 1941, the Army has already grown to more than 1.4 million men. Altogether, more than 16 million men and women will serve in the armed forces throughout the course of the war. Now, of course, one of the many effects of the war, of World War II on the United States, was the economic mobilization. Remember, the New Deal does not end the Depression. It helped. It staved off the falling tide. But what does get us out of the Great Depression, of course, is the economic mobilization for the war. World War II pulls the country out of this crisis. Now, of course, much like World War I, we need to mobilize economically. So while troops were easy, we still need to mobilize the stagnant economy. And we do so by reintroducing the War Powers Act. Now, the War Powers Act gives the ability to create, again, this War Production Board. And again, this is very similar to its counterpart back in World War I. Basically, the War Production Board, under the War Powers Act, is in charge of directing the industrial manufacturing of war materials. In other words, much like World War I, it's telling private businesses what to build, how much to build, and when to build it. Again, this is not the same act we have today. In fact, if you remember during 2020 coronavirus, the President Donald Trump, he often referenced that he enacted the War Production Act. This is a different act than what you see here. The act that he was referring to, he employed, authorized, was a result of the Korean War, which will be after this war in the 50s. But again, the same idea though. So it's not quite as stringent as it once was as far as World War I and World War II, but it still does exist that gives the president the power to mobilize private industry. So what does he do here? Well, on a massive scale, automakers begin building tanks. Shirt factories produce mosquito netting. Kitchen appliance manufacturers start producing ammunitions. Civilian industry is converted into wartime production on a massive scale. Now, I mentioned this before, I'm originally from Flint, Michigan. And I remember growing up, there was a huge GM building about 4 or 5 miles away from my house. And there used to be this big field there. And I remember the stories during World War II, that entire field was not filled with Chevy trucks, but rather with U.S. tanks. Now, fun fact, today there's a Walmart there. But back in the 40s, this was a place to stockpile tanks, right? And it wasn't just big business, so it was also your average Americans. You need to get the civilians involved in the wartime effort. And again, much like World War I, we talked about, then Herbert Hoover's in charge of, the food, right? And scrap and conserving materials and, not wasting them at home, but saving them for the troops. Well, again, tin, metal, rubber. You get the civilians to donate excess product. And this motto for World War II, the slogan was, quote, use it up, wear it out, make do, or do without. Again, much better than Herbert Hoover's little slogans. Wheatless Wednesdays. And again, this idea encourages the public to sacrifice for the part of the war. So you do things like you collect scrap metal, the tin you see on your screen. You don't drive your car. You walk to conserve gasoline. You grow victory gardens again in your backyard. And of course, tire rationing. In fact, they actually were given coupon books that you could only get so much of product at the store. You can only get rubber every so often for your tires. In other words, this is total economic wartime effort. If you are 5 years old, you are conserving going to find scrap tin, metal, rubber. If you're a female, you are, as we'll talk about later, involved in wartime industry. You are taking care of the house, the family, and maybe going to work now. And of course, the husbands, many of them are going off to war. Everybody's a part. I had an old colleague at University of Houston, who was studying women, and specifically studying women in Southern prisons. And she found out through interviews and through old research archives that prisoners even were eager participants to make wartime materials. And they were doing it as a way to prove their worth and citizenship. So even prisoners were getting involved in this. So nonstop work will win the war. I love this slide right here. It's just fascinating to me. It tells you, again, this is an easy chart that you can produce as propaganda, but it tells you this is how much rubber it'll take to produce these things to protect your man, your dad, as he's overseas. So collect it, all heirs of the family, share the meat. Now, I'm pretty sure this was not for a proper Texan, because I'm pretty sure 2.5 pounds of meat per week is not proper eating for a Texan, but the rest of the country, just maybe. Now, nonetheless, we need to organize our economic mobilization here. We need to fund this somehow, and basically it comes from the government. Now remember, I told you last lecture, one of the reasons people like Hitler and Mussolini were able to get out of the Depression so quickly was public works projects and massive military buildup. Well, our president, FDR, he was doing the first. He was doing the, government expenditures for infrastructure. He was doing CCC, WPA, etc., right? But now we get to kick in that second thing, that massive military spending. And in fact, the total government expenditure in World War II was double all previous war expenditures in history combined. So take all the wars we ever fought, how much money the government spent on those wars, and double it. That's how much money we spent in World War II. This is 10 times what we spent in World War I, 100 times what we spent in the Civil War. That whole unemployment of the Depression, virtually gone. Now, I'm not saying that 100% employment, but it's virtually gone. And of course, all groups of Americans will benefit from this. And we'll talk about that kind of in our later half of this lecture. But one of the problems with this, of course, is if these, remember we had the Depression, so companies were not producing mass quantities of commodities, and suddenly they finally get to reopen, hire people, but they're still not producing consumer goods because they're producing wartime materials. So people are getting money now, but they're very short on actual supply of products. And the government felt this was wrong, because what was happening was what we now term price gouging. Supply and demand, right? There's a crisis, we're short on supply. So again, 2020 coronavirus, people are selling hand sanitizer and toilet paper for $100 a roll. Why? Supply and demand. Now we call it price gouging now because it is in a bit of a crisis. But during World War II, there was also a crisis. People were not, there was not a ready supply of consumer products given the Depression and now the war effort, but now people had the money to spend, and so people were jacking up the price. And the government stepped in and said, no, you can't do this. This is gouging. And so during World War II, during 1942, the government opened the Office of Price Administration, which actually set price ceilings on large consumer products. In other words, prices were frozen. You couldn't raise them above a certain level. Again, this is a dictatorship on the economy. And the government stepped in to control this because if he didn't, there was going to be tremendous price gouging, which would ultimately hurt the economy in the long term and hurt production of war materials. So the government becomes extremely involved in the economy in a very unprecedented way. And the OPA, it really pissed off a lot of people. Now, those who were constitutional saying this is way government overreach, conservatives, this is government overreach. Business owners are really pissed off about this because you're limiting their ability to make money, right? And of course, workers are like, we want to buy stuff. Well, they were kind of happy about this actually a little bit. Now, as you can imagine, though, there was often strikes because of this, because not only were prices frozen, so were wages. So people were not getting, they're working more, they're producing lots of stuff, but they're not seeing the benefit when it comes to wage increases. Remember, this is the era, at this point, unions are a thing. General Motors has already been unionized, so was Chrysler, and Ford will be unionized during the war. But as a result of the OPA, again, making everybody mad, owners and workers, there was a constant threat of strikes. In fact, the government, to alleviate these strikes, remember there was a strike at Ford that will actually succeed, but there were other strikes so that the government would step in again and put down. There was a strike in the coal mines and railroads. And twice, one from the railroads, one from the coal mines. In 1943, the government will actually seize control of both the railroads and the coal mines. Again, wartime necessity. Now, they relinquished them, they gave them back, but is that legal? Can the government seize control of private business, even in a war? It's a question you should ask. That was 1943. 1944, the government took over Montgomery Ward. Now, I'm sad to say this, I'm sure none of you have a clue what Montgomery Ward is. I remember it. It was a department store like JCPenney, which is pretty much almost gone as well. But it was a big department store like JCPenney and Sears, and they sold clothes and appliances and all sorts. It was a hot, nice department store. They're long since bankrupting out of business now. They've been around for more than 100 years. And Montgomery Ward, they were facing a strike of its 12,000 workers, and the U.S. government sent in the military who walked into the head offices and actually carried the chairman of the company out of the building while he was still in his chair. Yeah, this is a dictatorship on the economy. Again, a la World War I. Now, there's some good stuff there. Again, the government's trying to protect the wartime effort and trying to protect consumers from gouging. But was it too much? That's not for me to decide right now. It's for you to think about. Moving on, though, one of the other big phenomena, remember in World War I, we had the Great Migration, right? African Americans moved from south to north. Well, during World War II, we experienced another huge migration effort, and this was the Western migration. World War II is dramatically going to change the demographics of our country. World War II completed the westward expansion that began back in the 1800s, post-Civil War period. During basically the decade of the 40s, so from 1940 to 1950, again, mostly for the war effort, more than 8 million people moved west the Mississippi River. Small cities like Phoenix and Albuquerque boomed. Larger cities like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego exploded. Let me give you an example. San Diego, the population increased 147% between 1941 and 1945. Why? Because the West Coast especially, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, these were places where wartime production was in full force. You had naval yards in Los Angeles and San Diego. You're building all these materials. Remember, Pacific Front, the Pacific War. And these 8 million people are drawn by these jobs, opportunities. And again, we're going to see not only we're going to see a large influx of African Americans as well, once again, but it's not just African Americans this time. This is a huge Western migration. that's going to demographically change our country. Again, World War II. However, there are a number of, these are all economic, demographic changes this way. There are also a number of social effects. Because individual groups that we want to talk about, like women, like African Americans, like Mexican Americans, like Japanese and Chinese, how do they fare during the war? That's a topic for the second half of our lecture. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.